Have you ever noticed how the most dangerous moments in life often happen in the most ordinary places? You're going about your day, maybe you're in California or Texas or wherever you're watching this from, thinking everything is normal, and then suddenly your past walks through the door and everything changes. Sometimes, though, when you think you're completely alone and helpless, protection comes from the most unexpected source. Mila Santos had learned to watch the door. Always the door. It was a habit born from 6 months of freedom and 2 years of hell before that. Every time the brass handle of Romano's Italian restaurant turned, every time the little bell above the entrance chimed, her dark brown eyes flicked up from whatever table she was serving to catalog who had entered. Safe regular customer, new family with children, business dinner for 4. Her internal checklist ran automatically now. A survival mechanism she couldn't seem to turn off even though Derek couldn't possibly know where she was working. At 24, Mila had perfected the art of being invisible while still doing her job well enough to earn the tips that kept her tiny studio apartment rent paid. She moved through the evening dinner rush at Romano's with practiced efficiency, her long black hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her white button-down shirt and black slacks the picture of professional composure. None of the customers would guess that underneath her calm exterior, her heart rate spiked every time someone walked in unexpectedly. None of them knew she kept pepper spray in her apron pocket or that she had memorized every exit in the building within her first week. Romano's was upscale without being pretentious, the kind of neighborhood place where families celebrated anniversaries and business deals were closed over wine and perfectly prepared ossobuco. The warm lighting and exposed brick walls should have felt welcoming, homey even, but Mila had trained herself not to get too comfortable anywhere. Comfort meant letting your guard down, and letting your guard down meant giving someone the opportunity to hurt you again. She was refilling the water glasses at table 12 when she noticed him. Table 15, the corner booth with a perfect view of both the front entrance and the kitchen doors. He came in every Tuesday and Thursday at exactly 7:30, always alone, always impeccably dressed in what her untrained eye could still recognize as expensive suits. Tonight it was charcoal gray with a crisp white shirt, no tie, the top button undone in a way that suggested confidence rather than carelessness. Dante Romano. She had learned his name from Maria, the hostess, who had mentioned in passing that he owned the restaurant. That explained why the other servers always made sure his table was perfect, why Chef personally prepared his meals, why even Tony the manager spoke to him with a deference that bordered on reverence. What it didn't explain was why he always requested to be seated in her section, or why his dark green eyes seemed to track her movement through the dining room with an attention that felt protective rather than predatory. He was probably in his mid-30s, tall enough that even sitting down his presence dominated the corner booth. His olive skin and strong jawline spoke to Italian heritage, but it was his eyes that caught her attention every time. Not just their unusual green-gray color, but the way they seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. When he looked at her, Mila felt like he was cataloging details the same way she cataloged potential threats, but his assessment felt like safety rather than danger. Tonight, he was reading something on his phone while cutting into the veal parmigiana that Chef had prepared without being asked. His movements were precise, controlled, the way someone moved when they were used to being watched and had learned to make every gesture count. There was something almost old-world about his manners, the way he placed his napkin, the way he nodded acknowledgement when she refilled his wine glass. Respectful, careful, completely different from the entitled grabbing and demanding she had grown accustomed to from Derek. Mila was carrying a tray of entrees to table 8 when the front door chimed again. She glanced up automatically, running through her mental checklist, and felt her entire world tilt sideways. Derek Matthews stood in the doorway, his pale blue eyes scanning the dining room with the focused intensity of a hunter tracking prey. 6 feet of lean muscle wrapped in the kind of casual arrogance that had once made her feel protected and now made her blood freeze in her veins. The heavy ceramic plates on her tray suddenly felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. Her hands began to shake, a fine tremor that started in her fingertips and radiated up her arms to her shoulders. She tried to keep moving toward table 8. Tried to pretend she hadn't seen him, hadn't felt her entire nervous system shift into the hyper-vigilant terror mode that had ruled her life for 2 years before she finally found the courage to run. How had he found her? She had been so careful, so perfectly careful. New apartment across town under her mother's maiden name. New job that she had found through a friend of a friend. New routines that avoided every place they had ever been together. She had deleted social media, changed her phone number, even started paying for everything in cash, so there would be no credit card trail for him to follow. 6 months of looking over her shoulder, 6 months of building something that felt almost like a normal life, and now he was here. Derek was still scanning the room when his gaze landed on her frozen form halfway between the kitchen and table 8. The smile that spread across his face was the same one that used to make her heart race with excitement and now made her stomach clench with remembered fear. He had always been handsome in a conventional way, the kind of clean-cut good looks that made people trust him immediately. Brown hair perfectly styled, expensive casual clothes that suggested success without trying too hard, the kind of smile that charmed everyone from her mother to her co-workers to the police officers who had taken her statement and then essentially told her there was nothing they could do about emotional abuse. No one ever believed that Derek Matthews, successful insurance agent and all-around nice guy, spent his private time systematically destroying her self-worth with a precision that would have impressed a military strategist. Table 8 was looking at her expectantly, waiting for their entrees, but Mila couldn't seem to make her legs work properly. The tremor in her hands had progressed to a full-body shake that made the plates on her tray rattle audibly. She tried to take a step forward and felt her knees buckle slightly, the weight of the tray suddenly overwhelming. Derek was moving now, threading his way between tables with the same confident stride that had once made her feel like the luckiest woman in the world. He was heading directly toward her, his smile widening as he got closer, and Mila realized with crystal clarity that she was about to have the confrontation she had spent 6 months trying to avoid in front of a dining room full of strangers who had no idea they were about to witness her humiliation. The tray slipped from her trembling hands. The crash was spectacular. 6 dinner plates, 2 bowls of soup, and assorted silverware hit the hardwood floor with a cacophony that brought every conversation in the restaurant to an immediate halt. Marinara sauce splattered across the floor in abstract red patterns, pasta scattered like confetti, and the sound of breaking ceramic seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Mila stood in the middle of the mess, her black work pants splashed with tomato sauce, her white shirt decorated with spots of olive oil, and felt the familiar sensation of the world closing in around her. Every eye in the restaurant was on her. Every face turned in her direction with expressions ranging from concern to annoyance to curiosity. She wanted to run, wanted to disappear, wanted to somehow rewind the last 30 seconds and handle everything differently. Derek was still approaching, his expression shifting to one of false concern, the same look he used to give her after he had spent an hour explaining all the ways she had disappointed him. Mila could practically hear his voice in her head, smooth and reasonable, telling everyone who would listen that she was clearly having some kind of breakdown, that he was just a concerned ex-boyfriend trying to help, that she had always been unstable, and this was exactly the kind of thing he had tried to protect her from when they were together. She opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to somehow explain what was happening, but no words came out. Her throat felt tight, closed, the way it always did when Derek was around, and she knew that anything she said could and would be used as evidence of her inadequacy later. That was when the voice spoke from behind her, low and calm, and carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the restaurant turn their attention away from her and toward the source. "Wait outside. I'll take care of this." The words were spoken softly, almost conversationally, but something in the tone made the hair on the back of Mila's neck stand up. She turned slowly and found Dante Romano standing less than 3 feet away, having somehow moved from his corner booth to her side without her noticing. Up close, he was even more imposing than she had realized. Easily 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled out his expensive suit in a way that suggested regular time in the gym. But it wasn't his size that made the entire restaurant seem to hold its breath. It was the way he was looking at Derek. Dante's green-gray eyes had gone completely cold, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the promise of consequences. His expression was perfectly calm, almost pleasant, But there was something underneath it that made Mila think of deep water and hidden currents and things that could pull you under before you even realized you were drowning. Derek had stopped moving. His confident stride faltered as he took in Dante's presence, his gaze flickering from the expensive suit to the perfectly styled dark hair to the kind of watch that cost more than most people made in 6 months. But it was something else that made Derek's expression shift from predatory confidence to uncertainty. Something in the way Dante held himself that suggested this was not a man who made empty threats or gave warnings he wasn't prepared to back up. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension that every person in the restaurant could feel even if they couldn't name it. Mila found herself caught between them, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it, her breathing shallow and quick. She had never seen Derek back down from anything, had spent 2 years watching him escalate every conflict until she was the one apologizing for things that weren't her fault, begging for forgiveness for crimes she hadn't committed. But Derek was backing down now. His pale blue eyes darted around the restaurant, taking in the faces of the other diners, all of whom were watching the confrontation with the kind of fascinated attention usually reserved for car accidents and reality television. When his gaze returned to Dante, some fundamental calculation had taken place, some recognition that this was not a battle he could win. The smile Derek had worn when he walked in was completely gone now, replaced by the kind of frustrated anger Mila knew all too well. It was the look he got when someone or something interfered with his plans, when the world failed to arrange itself according to his expectations. But underneath the anger was something she had never seen before in all the time she had known him. Derek Matthews was afraid. "I was just trying to talk to my ex-girlfriend," Derek said, his voice carrying the reasonable tone he always used when he was trying to convince someone that black was white and up was down. "There's no problem here. This is between me and Mila." Dante took a single step forward, a movement so small it was barely perceptible, but somehow managed to change the entire dynamic of the confrontation. When he spoke again, his voice was even quieter than before, so low that only Derek and Mila could hear the words. "There is no problem," Dante agreed, his tone conversational, almost friendly. "Because you're going to walk out that door, get in your car, and drive away. And you're going to keep driving until you're far enough away that the idea of coming back here never occurs to you again." The threat was delivered with the same tone someone might use to discuss the weather or comment on the wine selection, but the effect on Derek was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from his face, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment Mila thought he was going to say something else, something that would escalate the situation into the kind of public scene that would end with police and accusations and all the messy complications she had spent 6 months trying to avoid. Instead, Derek's gaze flicked once more around the restaurant, taking in the sea of faces still watching the drama unfold, and some final calculation took place behind his eyes. Whatever he saw in Dante's expression, whatever he heard in that quiet voice, it was enough to convince him that retreat was his only option. Without another word, Derek turned and walked back toward the front door, his movements stiff with barely contained anger. The bell chimed as he pushed through the entrance, and then he was gone, disappearing into the night as suddenly as he had appeared. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of scattered applause from a table near the window, quickly joined by others until the entire restaurant was clapping. Mila stood frozen in the middle of the mess she had made, sauce still dripping from her clothes, completely overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers and the realization that for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had stood up for her. Dante turned toward her, and the cold calculation that had faced down Derek was completely gone, replaced by something warm and concerned and infinitely gentle. When he spoke, his voice had returned to the tone she remembered from the few times they had interacted when she served his table, respectful and careful and completely unthreatening. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the simple question nearly undid her completely. Mila nodded quickly, not trusting her voice, and immediately began kneeling to collect the broken pieces of ceramic scattered around her feet. Her hands were still shaking, making the task nearly impossible, and she could feel tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. The adrenaline that had flooded her system when Derek appeared was beginning to ebb, leaving behind the kind of exhausted vulnerability that made her feel like she was made of tissue paper. A gentle hand touched her shoulder, stopping her frantic cleaning efforts. When she looked up, Dante was crouching beside her, his expression kind and patient. "Let someone else handle this," he said quietly. "You need a moment to recover." Before she could protest, he was helping her to her feet, his grip firm but careful, and guiding her toward the back of the restaurant where she knew the manager's office was located. The other servers and busboys immediately began cleaning up the mess she had left behind, working with the kind of efficient teamwork that suggested this was not the first time they had dealt with an unexpected situation. As they walked past his table, Mila noticed that his dinner sat abandoned, the veal probably growing cold, the wine glass still half full. He was sacrificing his own evening to make sure she was safe, and the kindness of the gesture hit her with an intensity that made her chest tight. The manager's office was small and cramped, filled with schedules and invoices and the general chaos of running a restaurant, but it felt like a sanctuary after the public nature of what had just happened. Dante guided her to the single chair in front of Tony's desk, and then moved to close the door, giving them privacy from the curious eyes of both staff and customers. When he turned back toward her, Mila finally found her voice, though it came out smaller and more fragile than she would have liked. "Thank you," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of 6 months of fear and isolation and the desperate hope that maybe, possibly, things could be different now. Dante's expression softened further, if that was possible, and when he smiled it was the kind of smile that made her think of safety and protection and all the things she had convinced herself she would never be able to trust again. "You don't need to thank me," he said gently. "Nobody should have to face something like that alone." The manager's office felt smaller with Dante Romano's presence filling it, though not uncomfortably so. Mila sat in Tony's worn desk chair, her hands finally beginning to steady as the adrenaline slowly worked its way out of her system. Dante had positioned himself near the door, she noticed, close enough to respond if Derek returned, but far enough away that she didn't feel trapped or threatened. Even in her shaken state, she appreciated the consideration. He was watching her with those unusual green-gray eyes, patient and calm, waiting for her breathing to return to normal before he spoke. There was something almost old-fashioned about his manners, the way he gave her time to recover without rushing or demanding explanations. It was such a stark contrast to Derek's constant need to control every moment, every conversation, every silence. When Dante finally spoke, his voice carried the same quiet authority that had sent Derek retreating, but gentle now, careful. "I should probably start with an introduction," he said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Dante Romano. I own Romano's, obviously, but there are some other things you should know about me before we go any further." Mila found herself studying his face as he spoke, taking in details she had only glimpsed during their brief interactions when she served his table. The strong jawline spoke to Italian heritage, but there were character lines around his eyes that suggested someone who had seen more of the world than most people his age. His dark hair was perfectly styled in a way that looked effortless, but probably required more time and product than she spent on her entire appearance. Most importantly, he continued, settling into a more relaxed posture against the wall, "Your ex-boyfriend isn't coming back tonight. Men like him, they're bullies at heart. They pick on people they think can't fight back, but they fold pretty quickly when they meet real opposition." "How do you know?" Mila asked, her voice still smaller than she would have liked. "How do you know he won't just wait for you to leave and come back?" Dante's expression grew more serious, thoughtful, like he was considering exactly how much truth to share with her. When he spoke again, there was something in his tone that made her listen more carefully, something that suggested the answer was more complicated than it appeared. "Because Romano's isn't just a restaurant," he said quietly. "It's part of a larger family business, and that business comes with certain protections. Your Derek struck me as someone smart enough to recognize when he's outmatched." Family business. The phrase hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Mila's mind immediately began racing to understand. She had heard whispers, of course, rumors about certain restaurants and construction companies and import businesses that operated under different rules than everyone else. Growing up in an Italian neighborhood, you learned to recognize the signs, the subtle markers that indicated which establishments existed under protection that had nothing to do with police or security companies. Looking at Dante now, really looking at him, She began to notice details that suddenly made more sense. The expensive watch that probably cost more than she made in a year. The way other customers and staff treated him with a deference that went beyond normal respect for a business owner. The quiet confidence that came not from arrogance, but from genuine power, the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself because everyone already knew it was there. "You're talking about organized crime," Mila said, the words feeling strange in her mouth. "The Mafia." Dante's expression didn't change, didn't deny or confirm, but something in his eyes acknowledged that she understood. "I'm talking about family," he said simply. "About protecting the people who matter, about maintaining order in a world that doesn't always operate by the rules most people think apply to everyone. But I want you to understand something important, Mila. I have never, will never, hurt an innocent person, especially a woman. That's not who I am, and it's not what my family stands for." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, but Mila felt her internal warning systems activating anyway. She had spent 2 years with someone who seemed perfect on the surface, someone everyone else thought was wonderful and caring and completely trustworthy. How was she supposed to trust her judgment about another man when her judgment had been so catastrophically wrong before? But even as the thought formed, she realized how different this felt from those early days with Derek. Derek had been charming, overwhelming, sweeping her off her feet with grand gestures and constant attention that had felt romantic at first and suffocating later. Dante was offering her space, time, information. He was asking for nothing and promising protection without demanding anything in return. "I understand if this makes you uncomfortable," Dante continued, his tone gentle but matter of fact. "I understand if you'd prefer to handle this situation on your own, find another solution. But I need you to understand something too. Men like your ex, they don't just give up. They escalate. They get angry about being publicly embarrassed, and they take that anger out on the person they blame for causing it." Mila felt her chest tighten as his words hit home. She knew Derek better than anyone, knew exactly how his mind worked when he felt humiliated or thwarted. He would blame her for tonight, would convince himself that she had somehow orchestrated the whole confrontation to make him look bad. In Derek's world, nothing was ever his fault, and everything that went wrong could be traced back to her inadequacy, her ingratitude, her fundamental failure to be the woman he deserved. "He'll come back," she whispered, more to herself than to Dante. "Maybe not tonight, but he'll figure out a way. He always does." "Yes," Dante agreed quietly, and she appreciated that he didn't try to minimize the threat or offer empty reassurances. "Which is why I'm going to make you an offer, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer." He moved away from the wall then, pulling up the single folding chair that was wedged between filing cabinets and positioning it so he could sit facing her at eye level. The gesture put them on equal footing, removed any sense of him looming over her or using his height to intimidate. Another small kindness that Derek never would have thought to offer. "I have a penthouse downtown," Dante said, his tone careful and measured. 3 bedrooms, completely secure, doorman and security system, and all the protection you could possibly need. "I'm offering you a place to stay until this situation with Derek is permanently resolved." The offer hit her like a physical blow, so unexpected and generous that for a moment she couldn't process it entirely. A complete stranger was offering her safety, shelter, protection from the nightmare that had defined her life for the past 6 months. It was the kind of rescue fantasy she had given up hoping for, the kind of intervention that happened in movies but never in real life. But even as part of her wanted to say yes immediately, another part was screaming warnings. Living with a man she barely knew, a man who had just admitted to being part of organized crime, a man whose world operated by rules she didn't understand. How was that any safer than dealing with Derek on her own? "I don't understand why you would do this," Mila said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even know me. We've barely spoken. Why would you offer to help a stranger?" Dante was quiet for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful, like he was considering how to explain something complex and deeply personal. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her think there were stories behind his words, experiences that had shaped his perspective in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. "My grandmother used to tell me that a man's character isn't measured by how he treats his equals," he said quietly. "It's measured by how he protects those who can't protect themselves. Women, children, anyone who's vulnerable or afraid." She said that power without purpose is just destruction, but power used to shield the innocent is what makes us human. He paused, his expression growing distant for a moment, like he was seeing something or someone from his past. I watched a woman get hurt once, someone who mattered to me, because I wasn't strong enough or smart enough or fast enough to stop it. He continued, his voice even quieter now. I swore that would never happen again, not while I had the ability to prevent it. So when I see someone in your situation, someone who's clearly been terrorized by a man who should have protected her instead of harmed her, I don't really have a choice about whether to help. It's who I am. The raw honesty in his voice hit her harder than any elaborate persuasion could have. This wasn't about her specifically, wasn't about attraction or ulterior motives or some complicated game she couldn't understand. This was about his own code, his own sense of responsibility to use his power and resources to help people who couldn't help themselves. But what about your life? Mila asked, grasping for practical concerns because the emotional weight of his offer was too much to process all at once. Your privacy, your space. Having a stranger living in your home, disrupting your routine. Dante's mouth curved into the first genuine smile she had seen from him, warm and slightly amused, like the concern was touching but unnecessary. I have plenty of space, he said simply. And I'm not home very much during the day anyway. Business keeps me busy, traveling, meetings, dealing with various family interests. You'd have the run of the place most of the time, complete privacy when you need it. He leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more serious again. But I want to be completely clear about something, Mila. This isn't a romantic proposition or some complicated arrangement where you'd owe me anything in return. You'd be a guest in my home, with your own room, your own space, complete autonomy over your choices and your life. The only thing I'd ask is that you let me know when you're coming and going so I can make sure you're safe. The careful way he outlined the boundaries, the explicit reassurance about her autonomy, the acknowledgement that she might be worried about ulterior motives. Everything about his approach suggested he understood exactly how vulnerable she was and was going out of his way to make sure she felt secure rather than trapped. But even as she recognized the thoughtfulness behind his offer, Mila felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was proposing. 6 months ago, she had been living with Derek, financially dependent on him, isolated from friends and family, slowly losing pieces of herself until she barely recognized the person she had become. The woman who had finally found the courage to leave in the middle of the night with nothing but a suitcase, and her mother's maiden name had sworn she would never put herself in a position to be controlled by another man again. I don't have any money, she said finally, the admission burning with shame but necessary. I can't pay you rent or contribute to expenses or anything like that. Everything I make goes to keeping my apartment and buying groceries and trying to save enough to maybe go back to school someday. Money isn't a concern, Dante replied immediately, his tone matter of fact rather than condescending. I'm not offering this because I need a roommate or want help with bills. I'm offering because you need somewhere safe to stay and I have the resources to provide that. The simplicity of his response, the way he dismissed her financial concerns without making her feel like a charity case, was almost harder to accept than criticism would have been. She was so used to every kindness coming with strings attached, every offer of help being leveraged later as evidence of her dependence and inadequacy. What about the police? She asked, grasping for alternatives that felt less overwhelming than accepting help from a virtual stranger. Maybe if I explain what happened tonight, show them that Derek is escalating. Dante's expression grew gentle but realistic, the look of someone who understood how the world actually worked versus how it was supposed to work. What exactly would you tell them? He asked quietly. That your ex-boyfriend came to your workplace? That he didn't actually threaten you directly or touch you or break any specific law? That a customer told him to leave and he left? The brutal accuracy of his assessment hit her like cold water. Derek had been careful tonight, just like he had always been careful. Threatening without explicitly threatening, intimidating without crossing legal lines, creating plausible deniability for every action while still making his message crystal clear. Even if they took your statement, Dante continued gently, what could they actually do? They can't arrest him for walking into a restaurant. They can't charge him with harassment for trying to talk to his ex-girlfriend. And restraining orders are just pieces of paper. They don't actually stop someone who's determined to cause harm. Mila closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her situation settling over her like a suffocating blanket. He was right, of course. She had looked into legal options months ago, had spoken to police officers and victims' advocates and lawyers who had all essentially told her the same thing. Unless Derek actually committed a crime, unless he physically harmed her or made explicit threats that could be documented, the system couldn't protect her from someone who was smart enough to terrorize her within legal boundaries. "I'm scared," she admitted finally, the words coming out in a rush before she could stop them. "Not just of Derek, but of making another mistake, of trusting someone I shouldn't trust, of ending up somewhere worse than where I started." Dante's expression softened with understanding, like her fear was completely reasonable rather than evidence of weakness or paranoia. "That's smart," he said quietly. "You should be cautious. You should ask questions and set boundaries and take as much time as you need to feel comfortable with any decision you make. But I want you to consider something. Right now, you're already in danger. Derek knows where you work, probably knows where you live, and tonight proved that he's willing to confront you publicly. Staying where you are isn't the safe choice anymore. It's just the familiar choice." The distinction hit her with uncomfortable clarity. She had been telling herself that maintaining her current life was the cautious option, the responsible choice, but really it was just the choice that didn't require her to trust anyone or risk anything new. And risk, she was beginning to realize, wasn't always about making bad choices. Sometimes it was about having the courage to accept help when you needed it. 20 minutes later, Mila found herself in the passenger seat of Dante's BMW, her single suitcase and 2 boxes of belongings loaded in the back seat. The decision had happened faster than she had expected, driven partly by logic and partly by the bone-deep exhaustion that came from living in constant fear for so long. The drive through downtown Portland gave her time to really look at him in profile, to notice details that had been obscured by adrenaline and shock back at the restaurant. He drove with the same careful precision he seemed to apply to everything else, checking mirrors regularly, taking routes that allowed him to monitor whether they were being followed. Even offering her sanctuary, he was thinking about her safety in ways that Derek never had. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of one of downtown's most exclusive buildings, the kind of place Mila had only ever seen in magazines or movies. The lobby was all marble and brass and understated elegance, the kind of environment where her work clothes and sauce-stained shirt made her impossibly impossibly out of place. The doorman greeted Dante by name with the kind of respectful familiarity that spoke to both routine and genuine regard. He introduced Mila simply as his guest without offering explanations or details, another small kindness that preserved her privacy while establishing her legitimacy. The elevator ride to the 22nd floor gave her time to question every decision that had led to this moment. But by the time the doors opened directly into Dante's foyer, curiosity had begun to override anxiety. The space was nothing like what she had expected from a man involved in organized crime, nothing like the gaudy excess she had seen in movies. Instead, it was elegant in a way that suggested genuine taste rather than a need to prove wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city lights spread out below, like a constellation of possibilities. The furniture was modern but warm, expensive but comfortable, the kind of environment that invited you to relax rather than worry about breaking something valuable. Everything was immaculately clean and perfectly arranged, but it felt lived in rather than staged. "This is beautiful," Mila said softly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Thank you," Dante replied, setting her suitcase down near the entrance. "Let me show you around, help you get settled." The tour revealed spaces that were somehow both impressive and homey. The kitchen was a chef's dream, all professional-grade appliances and marble countertops. But there were small personal touches that made it feel human. A collection of cookbooks with worn spines, herbs growing in small pots on the windowsill, a coffee maker that looked well used rather than decorative. "Your room is this way," Dante said, leading her down a hallway lined with what looked like original artwork. "It has its own bathroom, walk-in closet, whatever privacy you need." The guest room was larger than her entire studio apartment, furnished with a king-size bed, comfortable reading chair, and another set of floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a different view of the city. The attached bathroom was marble and glass and more luxurious than any hotel she had ever stayed in. "I hope you'll be comfortable here," Dante said, his tone careful, like he was genuinely concerned about her well-being rather than just being polite. "Is there anything you need right away? Anything I can get you or help you with?" Mila turned to look at him. This man who had appeared in her life like some kind of guardian angel, who had offered her safety and shelter and asked for nothing in return. Standing in the doorway of a bedroom that was more beautiful than anywhere she had ever slept, she felt the full weight of what he had given her settle over her like a warm blanket. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotions she couldn't quite name. "You don't need to thank me," Dante replied, the same words he had used in the restaurant office, but somehow they carried even more weight now. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we can figure out next steps. Make sure you have everything you need." He started to leave, then paused in the doorway, turning back to face her with an expression that was gentle but serious. "Mila," he said quietly, "you're safe here. I want you to know that, really know it. Whatever happens next, whatever we need to do about Derek, you're under my protection now. That means something in my world. It means no one will hurt you while you're here." After he left, Mila stood alone in the most beautiful room she had ever seen, looking out at a city that suddenly felt full of possibilities instead of threats. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that might have been hope beginning to unfold in her chest, fragile and tentative, but unmistakably real. Living with Dante Romano was nothing like what Mila had expected. A week into their arrangement, she was beginning to understand that her assumptions about dangerous men had been shaped entirely by Derek's particular brand of calculated cruelty, and Dante operated by completely different rules. He left every morning at 8:30, always impeccably dressed in one of his expensive suits, always taking a moment to ask if she needed anything before he went. Not in the controlling way that Derek used to interrogate her about her plans, but with genuine concern for her comfort and safety. He would return around 6, sometimes earlier if business concluded quickly, always checking in to see how her day had gone. The penthouse felt different with him gone during the day, quieter but not lonely. Mila had spent the first few days cautiously exploring the space, afraid to touch anything or make herself too comfortable in surroundings that were so far beyond anything she had ever experienced. But gradually, as Dante continued to encourage her to treat the place as her home rather than just a temporary shelter, she began to relax into the luxury of having space to breathe. The kitchen had become her favorite room, perhaps because it felt the most lived in, the most human. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows made the marble countertops glow like something out of a magazine, but the well-worn cookbooks and herb garden on the windowsill made it feel approachable rather than intimidating. She was attempting to make coffee in Dante's elaborate espresso machine when he appeared in the doorway on Thursday morning, already dressed for work, but moving with less than his usual purposeful efficiency. His dark hair was perfectly styled as always, but there was something in his expression that suggested he had something on his mind beyond his normal business concerns. "You're up early," he observed, his voice carrying the warm tone she was beginning to associate with their domestic moments together. "Couldn't sleep," Milo admitted, frustrated by her inability to operate what should have been a simple appliance. "I think I broke your coffee maker." Dante moved to stand beside her at the counter, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle that reminded her of cedar and bergamot. His presence should have made her nervous, she thought. A week ago, having a man she barely knew standing so close would have triggered every alarm system Derek had installed in her psyche. Instead, she found his proximity oddly comforting. "It's a little temperamental," he said, his hands moving over the machine with practiced efficiency. "My grandmother gave this to me when I got my first apartment. She insisted that no Italian man should ever have to drink bad coffee, even if he was too stubborn to learn proper cooking." The mention of his grandmother brought a smile to his face that transformed his entire expression, softening the sharp edges that made him look so formidable in business contexts. Watching his hands as he coaxed perfect espresso from the vintage machine, Mila found herself wondering what other stories lay behind that smile. What other pieces of his life might contradict her assumptions about men like him? "She sounds like she was an amazing woman," Mila said softly, accepting the small ceramic cup he offered her. "She was the strongest person I ever knew," Dante replied, his voice carrying a reverence that made her think there was much more to that story. "She raised 6 children during the Depression, buried 3 of them before they reached 30, and never let anyone see her cry. But she could make you feel like the most important person in the world when she was cooking for you. There was something in the way he spoke about his grandmother that made Mila want to hear more, want to understand the experiences that had shaped this complicated man who could be terrifying to her enemies and impossibly gentle with her. But before she could ask follow-up questions, his phone buzzed against the marble counter, demanding his attention. The change in his expression as he read the message was immediate and dramatic. The warmth disappeared, replaced by the same cold calculation she had seen when he faced down Derek at the restaurant. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and when he looked up at her, she could see him making an effort to keep his anger from showing in his voice. "Derek called Romano's last night," Dante said quietly, his tone carefully controlled. "Asked to speak to you, wanted to know if you were scheduled to work today. Tony told him you were no longer employed there." Mila felt her stomach drop, the brief moment of domestic normalcy shattered by the reminder that her past was still very much present in her life. She had known this was coming, had been waiting for Derek to make his next move, but somehow the reality of it still hit her like a physical blow. "What did he say?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "That he was concerned about your well-being," Dante replied, his voice growing harder with each word. "That you had seemed upset and unstable when he saw you, and he was worried you might do something to hurt yourself. He wanted Tony to give him your address so he could check on you." The manipulation was so perfectly Derek that Mila almost laughed, except there was nothing funny about how well she could predict his thought processes. He was painting himself as the concerned ex-boyfriend, worried about her mental health, positioning any resistance to his involvement as evidence that she really was unstable and needed his intervention. "He's setting up a narrative," she said quietly, more to herself than to Dante. "Making it look like I'm the problem, like I'm some kind of danger to myself, so that when he does something, it looks like he was trying to help." Dante's expression grew even more serious, his green-gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel like he was cataloging every emotion that crossed her features. "Has he done this before?" he asked. "Created false narratives to justify his behavior?" Mila set down her coffee cup with hands that were beginning to tremble again, the familiar fear response that Derek's presence could trigger even when he wasn't physically there. The question opened doors in her memory that she had spent months trying to keep closed, brought back the systematic way he had undermined her reality until she couldn't trust her own perceptions. It was how he controlled everything, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He would do something cruel or manipulative, then convince everyone, including me, that I was overreacting, that I was too sensitive, that I was making problems where none existed. By the end, I honestly didn't know what was real anymore. The silence that followed her admission was heavy with understanding. When she looked up at Dante, she saw something in his expression that looked like recognition, like he had encountered this particular form of psychological warfare before and understood exactly how devastating it could be. "That's not going to happen this time," he said quietly, his voice carrying a conviction that made her want to believe him. "Derek doesn't get to control the narrative anymore. He doesn't get to make you question your reality or doubt your own experiences." There was something in his tone that made her think he was speaking from personal experience, that his understanding of manipulation and gaslighting came from more than just observing it from the outside. Before she could explore that thought further, his phone buzzed again, and this time his expression went from anger to something much more dangerous. "There's more," he said after reading the new message. "He went to your old apartment building last night, told the landlord he was your boyfriend, and you had asked him to pick up some things you left behind. When they wouldn't let him in, he became agitated, started making threats about what would happen if something bad happened to you, because they wouldn't let him help." Mila felt the world tilt sideways, the same sensation she had experienced when Derek walked into the restaurant, but amplified by the realization that her fears had been completely justified. He wasn't going to give up. He wasn't going to accept that she had escaped his control and moved on with her life. He was escalating, just like Dante had predicted, and every move he made was designed to tighten the net around her while maintaining his facade of concerned ex-boyfriend. "I should have known," she said, her voice thick with self-recrimination. "I should have realized he would do this. I should have been better prepared." Dante was beside her in an instant, his hands gentle on her shoulders, his presence warm and steady in a way that helped anchor her in the present moment rather than spiraling into panic about the future. "None of this is your fault," he said firmly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made it impossible to argue. "You couldn't have predicted his specific actions, and you couldn't have prevented them. The only person responsible for Derek's behavior is Derek." The simple clarity of his statement cut through the fog of self-blame that had immediately engulfed her, reminding her of truths she had spent months trying to internalize. Derek's choices were his own. His escalation, his manipulation, his refusal to accept her decision to leave. None of that was something she had caused or could control. But even knowing that intellectually, the fear remained. Derek was out there, actively working to insert himself back into her life, and every move he made was designed to isolate her further from the safety and independence she had fought so hard to achieve. "What happens now?" she asked, looking up at Dante's face and finding reassurance in the calm determination she saw there. "Now we make sure he understands that continuing this behavior will have consequences he's not prepared for," Dante replied, his tone matter of fact, but carrying undertones that reminded her exactly who she was dealing with. "And we take steps to ensure your safety that go beyond just you staying here." The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and quiet conversations that Dante conducted in Italian, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made it clear he was used to having his instructions followed without question. Mila spent most of the afternoon trying to distract herself with books from his extensive library, but her attention kept drifting to the man who had somehow become her protector. It wasn't until evening, when they were sitting in his kitchen sharing the pasta dinner he had insisted on cooking, that she finally found the courage to ask the question that had been building in her mind all day. "Why are you doing this?" she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. "Not just offering me a place to stay, but actively protecting me from Derek. Getting involved in something that's really not your problem." Dante was quiet for a long moment, his fork paused halfway to his mouth, his expression thoughtful in a way that suggested her question had touched on something deeper than surface explanations. "When I was 8 years old," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual, "my father came home drunk and angry about some business deal that had gone wrong. My mother said something, some small comment about maybe he should eat something before drinking more, and he backhanded her so hard she hit the wall and didn't get up for almost 10 minutes. The casual way he delivered the devastating information hit Mila harder than if he had dramatized it, the matter-of-fact tone suggesting this was just one memory among many similar ones. "I stood there and watched it happen," Dante continued, his gaze fixed on his plate rather than meeting her eyes. "I was 8 years old and I stood there and did nothing while my father hurt my mother. I told myself I was too small, too young, that there was nothing I could have done, but the truth is I was just scared." Mila felt her chest tighten with sympathy for the child he had been, for the impossible situation that had shaped his understanding of protection and responsibility. She wanted to tell him that 8-year-old children couldn't be expected to intervene in adult violence, that his fear had been completely reasonable, but something in his expression suggested he had never forgiven himself for that moment of helplessness. "My mother died when I was 16, he continued, his voice even quieter now. "Cancer, not violence. But I always wondered if years of stress and fear had weakened her somehow, made her more susceptible. I swore at her funeral that I would never again stand by and watch someone hurt a person who couldn't protect themselves." The raw honesty of his confession hit her with an intensity that made her throat tight with unshed tears. This wasn't about her specifically, wasn't about attraction or romantic interest, or any of the complicated motivations she had been afraid to consider. This was about a promise he had made to himself and his mother's memory, about using his power and resources to prevent others from experiencing the helplessness he had felt as a child. "I'm sorry," she said softly, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "I'm sorry that happened to you and your mother. I'm sorry you had to carry that responsibility when you were still a child." Dante looked up then, meeting her eyes with an expression that was grateful but also slightly surprised, like he wasn't used to having his own pain acknowledged rather than dismissed. "My point is," he said gently, "when I see someone in your situation, someone who's being terrorized by a man who should have protected her instead of harmed her, I don't really have a choice about whether to help. It's who I am. It's what my mother would have wanted me to do." They finished dinner in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. But the quality of the quiet had changed. The vulnerability he had shared created a new kind of intimacy between them, a deeper understanding that went beyond the practical arrangement of protection and shelter. Later, as Mila helped him clean up the kitchen, she became acutely aware of how domestic the scene felt, how natural it was beginning to seem to share space with him, to fall into routines that felt like a partnership rather than a temporary necessity. When he handed her a dish to dry, their fingers brushed against each other, and for the first time she felt a flutter of attraction that had nothing to do with gratitude or the safety he represented. He must have felt it too, because he paused in his movements, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. For a moment, the kitchen felt charged with possibility, with the potential for something more than protection and circumstance to develop between them. The moment was broken by the sharp ring of his phone, cutting through the charged atmosphere like a blade. Dante answered it with obvious reluctance, his expression growing grim as he listened to whatever information was being relayed. When he hung up, his face was tight with controlled anger, and Mila felt her stomach drop before he even spoke. "Derek made contact with your sister," he said quietly, his tone careful but not hiding the seriousness of the situation. "Called her college, told them he was your emergency contact and needed to speak with her about a family crisis." The fear that washed over Mila was different from anything she had experienced before, sharper and more desperate because it involved someone she loved rather than just her own safety. Lucia was only 19, naive in ways that Mila had been at that age, trusting in ways that Derek would exploit without hesitation. "Did he talk to her?" Mila asked, her voice barely steady. "The school wouldn't give him her contact information, but they did confirm she was a student there," Dante replied, his hands already moving to his phone to make another call. "Which means he now knows where to find her if he decides to escalate further." As Dante began speaking rapidly in Italian to whoever answered his call, coordinating protection for a girl he had never met simply because she mattered to Mila, she realized something that should have terrified her, but somehow didn't. She was falling for him, despite every rational reason to maintain emotional distance. Despite every survival instinct Derek had installed in her psyche, despite the complicated danger of his world and the uncertainty of their situation, she was beginning to care about Dante Romano in ways that had nothing to do with the safety he offered and everything to do with the man he was beneath the power and protection. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, that possibility felt like hope rather than danger. The information about Derek's escalation came in pieces over the next few days, delivered by men who appeared at Dante's penthouse with the kind of quiet efficiency that spoke to years of practice in gathering intelligence. Mila was beginning to understand that Dante's organization was far more extensive than she had initially realized, a network of people who could track movements and uncover information that would be impossible for ordinary citizens to access. Marco Benedetti was Dante's second in command, a man in his late 20s with nervous energy and sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of whatever room he entered. When Dante introduced him as family, Mila understood that the relationship went beyond blood, encompassing the kind of loyalty that was earned rather than inherited. "We've been monitoring Derek's activities since the restaurant incident," Marco explained during one of his morning briefings, his tone professional but tinged with the kind of disgust that suggested personal investment in the outcome. "He's been making inquiries about you at places you used to frequent, asking questions about your habits and routines. But more concerning," Marco continued, consulting his notes, "he's borrowed a significant amount of money from some very unpleasant people. The kind of people who expect prompt repayment and don't care much about the methods used to ensure they get it." Dante's expression was stone cold as he processed this information, his mind clearly calculating implications and potential responses. Mila found herself studying his face, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when he was angry, the way his eyes went completely flat when he was considering options that ordinary people would never have to contemplate. "How much money?" Dante asked quietly. $15,000, Marco replied, and Mila saw something that might have been satisfaction cross his expression. "From Vincent Torino's organization." The name clearly meant something to both men, because Dante's mouth curved into what could generously be called a smile, but looked more like a predator recognizing prey. "Vincent's not known for his patience," Dante observed, his tone conversational, but carrying undertones that made Mila think there was history between him and this Vincent person. "No, sir," Marco agreed. "Word is Derek told him he was getting married soon, that he'd have access to his future wife's family money to cover the debt, which means he's counting on getting Mila back to solve his financial problems." The casual way they discussed Derek's desperation should have been disturbing, but instead Mila felt a strange sense of validation. For so long, Derek had controlled the narrative around their relationship, painting himself as the reasonable one and her as the problem. Having his behavior analyzed and dissected by people who understood manipulation and control made her feel like her perceptions had been accurate all along. Rosa Martinelli arrived later that morning to prepare lunch for the business dinner Dante was hosting that evening. She was a small woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair and the kind of maternal authority that made even dangerous men behave like obedient children. When Dante introduced Mila as his guest, Rosa's sharp dark eyes studied her with the kind of assessment that felt thorough but not unkind. "You're too thin," Rosa announced after completing her evaluation, her accented English carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Men like Dante, they need women who can hold their own, not fragile birds who break at the first sign of trouble." It should have been insulting, but the way Rosa said it made Mila understand that it was actually a compliment wrapped in practical advice. This woman was evaluating her as a potential partner for someone she clearly cared about, measuring her strength rather than her decorative value. "I can teach you to make his grandmother's ragu," Rosa continued, apparently having decided that Mila was worth investing in. "A man who eats well is a man who comes home, and a woman who can feed her family properly is a woman who has real power." Spending the afternoon learning traditional Italian cooking from Rosa felt like being initiated into secrets that went beyond recipes and techniques. Every instruction came with stories about family gatherings and holiday traditions, about the importance of food as love and the kitchen as the heart of any real home. When Dante returned from his business meetings that evening, the penthouse smelled like garlic and herbs and simmering tomatoes, the kind of aromatic welcome that transformed elegant spaces into something warmer and more personal. The look on his face when he walked into the kitchen and saw Mila stirring the sauce under Rosa's watchful supervision was worth every hour of chopping vegetables and learning the precise timing that made the difference between good pasta and exceptional pasta. "You've been busy," he observed, his voice carrying the warm tone she had come to associate with their domestic moments together. "Rosa has been teaching me family secrets," Mila replied, surprised by how natural it felt to claim some connection to his traditions, his people, his world. "Good," Rosa announced with satisfaction, untying her apron and gathering her things. "This one learns quickly. She has good instincts, and she listens to instruction." "You could do worse, Dante." The casual way the older woman spoke about Mila as a potential partner should have been presumptuous, but instead it felt like acceptance, like being evaluated and found worthy of inclusion in something larger than herself. That evening's business dinner was Mila's first real glimpse into Dante's professional world, and watching him interact with the other men who arrived at precisely 8 o'clock was like seeing an entirely different side of his personality. The careful gentleman who cooked her breakfast and asked about her day was still there, but layered underneath was something harder and more commanding, the kind of natural authority that made other powerful men defer to his opinions and seek his approval. The conversation was conducted partly in English and partly in Italian, covering topics that ranged from legitimate business investments to matters that were clearly more complex and potentially dangerous. Mila served dinner and refilled wine glasses, trying to be unobtrusive while observing the dynamics at play around the table. What struck her most was how the other men treated her, not as decoration or distraction, but with the kind of respectful attention that suggested they understood she mattered to Dante and therefore mattered to them. When she offered seconds or cleared plates, they thanked her with genuine appreciation rather than dismissive acknowledgement. After the guests left around 11, Mila found herself alone with Dante for the first time in days, the charged atmosphere of the evening settling into something more intimate and personal. They cleaned up the dinner dishes together in comfortable silence, falling into the domestic rhythm that was becoming natural despite the short time they had known each other. "You impressed them tonight," Dante said as they finished loading the dishwasher, his voice carrying a note of pride that made her chest warm with pleasure. "I didn't do anything special," Mila replied, genuinely confused by the compliment. "Just served dinner and tried to stay out of the way." "You carried yourself with grace under circumstances that would have intimidated most people," Dante explained, leaning against the counter in a way that brought him closer to her. "You showed respect for traditions you don't fully understand yet, and you made my guests feel welcomed in my home." "That's not nothing, Mila. That's everything." The sincerity in his voice, the way he was looking at her like she had accomplished something genuinely impressive, made her throat tight with emotion. Derek had spent 2 years convincing her that she was socially awkward and embarrassing, that her presence at business functions was a liability he had to manage. Having Dante see her as an asset, as someone who enhanced rather than detracted from his world, felt like discovering a part of herself she had forgotten existed. "Would you like to sit outside for a while?" Dante asked, gesturing toward the terrace that overlooked the city. "It's a beautiful night, and I feel like we haven't had a chance to really talk since everything started moving so quickly." The terrace was another revelation, a private oasis 22 floors above the city with comfortable seating and small trees that somehow thrived despite the elevation. The view of Portland spread out below them was breathtaking. All lights and movement and life continuing in countless small dramas that felt very far away from their private bubble of safety. Dante opened a bottle of wine, something red and expensive that tasted like cherries and earth and complexity, and they settled into chairs that faced each other across a small table that suddenly felt both too large and too small for the conversation they were about to have. "I need you to know something," Dante said after they had sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, his voice carrying the careful tone he used when he was about to share something significant. "What's developing between us? It's not just circumstance or gratitude or the intensity of the situation we're in." Mila felt her heart rate pick up, the flutter of attraction she had been trying to ignore suddenly demanding acknowledgement. She had been wondering if the growing warmth between them was one-sided, if she was reading more into his kindness than actually existed. "I've been attracted to you since the first time you served my table at Romano's," Dante continued, his green-gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel like he was memorizing every detail. "The way you moved through the dining room like you were trying to be invisible, the careful way you interacted with customers, the sadness in your eyes that you tried so hard to hide. I wanted to know what had put that sadness there, and I wanted to be the person who helped you find reasons to smile again." The raw honesty of his admission hit her with an intensity that made breathing difficult. All those Tuesday and Thursday dinners, all those polite interactions and careful conversations, he had been thinking about her, noticing her, caring about her well-being in ways she had never suspected. "I thought I was imagining it," Mila said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The way you looked at me sometimes, the way you always seemed to be watching out for me even before Derek showed up. I told myself it was wishful thinking, that someone like you would never be interested in someone like me." "Someone like you," Dante repeated, his voice carrying a note of incredulity that suggested her self-assessment was fundamentally flawed. "Mila, you're beautiful and intelligent and stronger than you realize. You survived 2 years with a man who was systematically trying to destroy your sense of self-worth, and you found the courage to leave when staying would have been easier. You've adapted to circumstances that would have broken most people, and you've done it with grace and dignity that amazes me every day." The way he described her, the qualities he saw in her that she had never thought to claim for herself, made her realize how thoroughly Derek had succeeded in convincing her that she was less than she was. Hearing herself described as strong and graceful and worthy of admiration felt like putting on clothes that fit properly for the first time in years. "I don't want you to feel pressured," Dante continued, his tone gentle but serious. "You're under my protection regardless of anything else that develops between us. Your safety and well-being don't depend on reciprocating feelings or accepting advances. I want you to know that with complete certainty." The careful way he established boundaries, the explicit reassurance that her security wasn't conditional on romance, made her trust him even more completely. Derek had always made everything conditional, every kindness dependent on her gratitude and compliance. Having Dante offer her autonomy and choice felt like being given something precious and rare. Instead of responding with words, Mila stood from her chair and moved to sit on the arm of his, close enough to smell his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his body. When she reached out to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw with tentative fingers, his eyes darkened with want, but his body remained perfectly still, letting her control the pace and depth of contact. "I don't feel pressured," she said quietly, her thumb brushing across his lower lip in a caress that made his breath catch. "I feel safe. And I haven't felt safe with a man in so long that I had forgotten what it was supposed to feel like." When he kissed her, it was with the same careful attention he brought to everything else involving her well-being. Slow and gentle and questioning, giving her time to respond or retreat as she chose. The taste of wine on his lips, the careful way his hands came up to frame her face without trapping her, the patient way he let her deepen the kiss when she was ready, all of it reinforced her growing understanding that this man would never take more than she was willing to give. What happened next unfolded like a conversation conducted entirely through touch and breath, and the kind of trust that had to be earned rather than demanded. When she stood and took his hand, leading him inside toward the bedrooms, his eyes searched her face for any sign of uncertainty or reluctance. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly, his voice rough with want but steady with control. "I'm sure," Mila replied, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was completely certain of her own desires, her own choices, her own agency in determining what happened next. The intimacy that followed was everything Derek had never been, patient and generous and focused entirely on her comfort and pleasure. Every touch was a question, every caress a conversation, every moment of connection building trust rather than taking it. When she showed him the small scars Derek had left on her body, the places where rough handling had marked her skin, Dante's response was gentle fury followed by exquisite tenderness, as if he could heal old wounds through the careful application of new kindness. Afterward, lying in his arms while the city lights painted patterns on the ceiling, Mila felt transformed in ways that went beyond the physical. Being desired rather than used, cherished rather than claimed, protected rather than controlled, it was like discovering what intimacy was supposed to feel like when both people genuinely cared about the other's well-being. "This changes things," Dante said quietly, his hand stroking through her hair with the kind of reverence that made her feel precious rather than possessed. "Yes," Mila agreed, pressing closer to his warmth and strength and the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "It changes everything." They were still wrapped around each other when Dante's phone rang at 6 in the morning, shattering the peaceful bubble they had created with the sharp intrusion of external reality. The expression on his face as he answered the call told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke. Derek had made contact with Lucia directly, bypassing the college's protective protocols through means that suggested escalation beyond rational behavior. And this time, his message had been explicitly threatening, making it clear that Mila's sister would pay the price for her continued refusal to return to him. As Dante began coordinating an immediate response to protect a girl he had never met simply because she mattered to Mila, she realized that the connection they had forged the night before was about to be tested in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The call came at 2 in the afternoon on Friday, just as Mila was beginning to believe that maybe Derek's threats were empty posturing designed to frighten rather than genuine promises of escalation. She was in the kitchen preparing lunch when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize, and some instinct made her answer it despite every rational reason to let unknown calls go to voicemail. "Mila," Derek's voice was tight with the kind of barely controlled emotion that she had learned to recognize as his most dangerous state. "I think we need to talk." The sound of his voice after days of secondhand reports about his activities hit her like a physical blow, immediately triggering the hyper-vigilant terror response she thought she had begun to overcome. Her hands started shaking so badly that she almost dropped the phone, her breathing becoming shallow and quick as her nervous system shifted into survival mode. "I don't have anything to say to you, Derek," Mila managed, proud that her voice came out steadier than she felt. "And I don't want you calling me. I think you'll change your mind when you hear what I have to tell you," Derek replied, his tone carrying the false reasonableness that had always preceded his worst behavior. "I'm with your sister right now. Sweet little Lucia. She's even prettier than her pictures on social media." The world tilted sideways as his words registered, everything in her peripheral vision going gray as panic flooded her system. Lucia was supposed to be safe at college, protected by distance and Derek's apparent focus on Mila herself. The idea that he had somehow gotten close enough to her 19-year-old sister to take her was beyond her worst nightmares. "You're lying," Mila said, but even as the words left her mouth she knew he wasn't. Derek was many things, but he wasn't stupid enough to make threats he couldn't follow through on. "Am I?" Derek asked, and she could hear the satisfaction in his voice, the pleasure he took in having regained control over her emotional state. "Lucia, say hello to your big sister." The voice that came on the line was small and frightened and unmistakably her sister's, the girl who had been planning to major in art therapy and volunteer at animal shelters and build a life full of kindness and creativity. "Mila," Lucia whispered, her voice thick with tears, "I'm sorry, I didn't know. He said you were in an accident, that I needed to come with him to see you in the hospital." The manipulation was so perfectly Derek, so exactly the kind of emotional leverage he specialized in using, that Mila felt sick with fury at herself for not anticipating this possibility. Of course he would target Lucia. Of course he would find a way to use her love for her family against her. "Let her go, Derek," Mila said, her voice shaking with rage rather than fear now. "This is between you and me. She has nothing to do with any of this." "Actually," Derek replied, his tone becoming more conversational, more pleased with himself, "she has everything to do with this. Because she's the reason you're going to come meet me, alone, without any of your new friends getting involved." By the time Derek finished explaining his demands, Mila understood that this had moved beyond harassment or stalking into genuinely dangerous territory. He wanted her to come to an abandoned warehouse on the industrial side of town, alone, by 6 that evening. He wanted her to bring $10,000, money she obviously didn't have, as proof of her commitment to resolving their situation. And he wanted her to come prepared to have a serious conversation about their future together. The implicit threats behind his reasonable tone were crystal clear. Lucia's safety depended on Mila's compliance, and any attempt to involve law enforcement or outside help would result in consequences that Derek was clearly prepared to inflict. After the call ended, Mila sat in Dante's kitchen staring at her phone and feeling the weight of impossible choices settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Every instinct screamed that she should tell Dante immediately, should let him coordinate a response that would ensure both her and Lucia's safety. But Derek had been explicit about the consequences of involving anyone else, and she couldn't risk her sister's life on the assumption that even Dante's resources would be enough to guarantee a safe outcome. She was still sitting there 20 minutes later when Dante came home early from his business meetings, taking one look at her expression and immediately shifting into the focused alertness that meant he was assessing threats and calculating responses. "What happened?" he asked quietly, moving to sit beside her at the kitchen island, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to feel overwhelming. Mila told him everything, watching his expression grow progressively more dangerous as she relayed Derek's demands and threats. By the time she finished explaining about the warehouse meeting and the money and the explicit warnings about involving outside help, Dante's eyes had gone completely cold in the way that reminded her exactly how dangerous he could be when someone threatened people he cared about. "You're not going," Dante said flatly, his tone carrying the kind of absolute authority that suggested the matter was not open for discussion. "I have to go," Mila replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her system. "He has my sister, Dante. If I don't show up, if he even suspects that I've told anyone about this, he'll hurt her." "Derek's not going to hurt anyone," Dante said quietly, his hands already moving to his phone to begin making calls. "But you're also not going to walk into an obvious trap without backup and resources and every possible advantage we can arrange." The conversation that followed revealed the extent of Dante's organizational capabilities in ways that both impressed and frightened Mila. Within an hour, he had men surveilling the warehouse Derek had specified, tracking equipment installed in vehicles that could monitor the situation from multiple angles, and backup teams positioned at strategic points around the industrial district. But more than just tactical preparation, Dante insisted on understanding every detail of Derek's psychology and past behavior, building a profile that would allow them to predict his likely responses and plan accordingly. He's desperate, Dante observed after Mila had described Derek's escalating financial problems and increasingly erratic behavior. Men in his position, facing debt to people like Vincent Torino's organization, they don't make rational decisions. They make emotional ones, and emotional decisions in desperate circumstances are usually violent ones. The plan they eventually developed was more complex than Mila had expected, but simpler than she had feared. She would go to the warehouse as demanded, but wearing a concealed communication device that would allow Dante's team to monitor everything that happened. She would appear to be alone while actually being surrounded by protection she couldn't see. Most importantly, Dante would be close enough to intervene the moment Derek's behavior escalated beyond verbal threats, but far enough away to avoid triggering the violent response that might endanger Lucia. "I need you to promise me something," Dante said as they prepared to leave for the warehouse district, his hands gentle on her shoulders, his green-gray eyes intense with emotion. "Whatever happens in there, whatever Derek says or does, I need you to remember that you're not the same woman who was trapped with him for 2 years. You're stronger now, you have people who care about you, and you have choices you didn't have before." The drive to the warehouse felt like traveling towards some kind of reckoning that went beyond just resolving Derek's threats. Sitting in the passenger seat of Dante's BMW, watching the city give way to industrial buildings and empty lots, Mila realized that this confrontation would determine not just her immediate safety, but the entire direction of her future. Either she would find a way to definitively end Derek's control over her life, or she would be pulled back into the nightmare she had spent 6 months trying to escape. The warehouse Derek had chosen was exactly the kind of isolated location that suggested he had given serious thought to his plans, far from residential areas and surrounded by other abandoned buildings that would muffle sound and prevent witnesses. As Dante's car pulled up to the designated meeting point, Mila could see Derek's sedan parked near a side entrance, its presence both expected and ominous. "I'll be watching everything," Dante reminded her as she prepared to get out of the car, his voice steady but tight, with the kind of controlled tension that came from sending someone you cared about into danger. "The moment he crosses the line from threats to action, we move. You won't be alone in there, no matter how it looks." The warehouse interior was dimly lit by industrial lighting that created harsh shadows and left large areas in darkness, the kind of environment where visibility was limited and escape routes were unclear. Derek was waiting in the center of the space, and even from a distance Mila could see that the past months had changed him in ways that made him more dangerous rather than less. He was thinner than she remembered, his clothes hanging loosely on a frame that suggested poor eating and high stress. His eyes had a feverish quality that spoke to sleepless nights and possibly chemical assistance in staying alert. Most concerning, his movements had the jittery unpredictability that came from someone operating on the edge of emotional control. Lucia was sitting in a folding chair about 20 feet away from Derek, her hands secured behind her back with zip ties, her eyes wide with fear, but alert enough to suggest she hadn't been seriously harmed. The relief Mila felt at seeing her sister alive and conscious was immediately overwhelmed by fury at Derek's callousness in involving an innocent person in their conflict. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," Derek said as Mila approached, his voice carrying the same false friendliness that had always preceded his worst behavior. "I thought maybe your new boyfriend would convince you to let the professionals handle this." "He's not my boyfriend," Mila replied, keeping her voice steady and her attention divided between Derek and Lucia. "And I came because you have my sister, not because I want to be here." Derek's expression darkened at her response, his casual facade slipping to reveal the anger and desperation that were driving his increasingly erratic behavior. "Always so ungrateful," he said, his tone becoming harder, more familiar. "I offer you everything, protection and love and a future, and you throw it away to play house with some criminal who's going to get tired of you the minute he realizes what you really are." The words were designed to hit every insecurity Derek had spent 2 years installing in her psyche, every doubt about her worthiness and desirability that he had carefully cultivated through systematic emotional abuse. 6 months ago, those words would have landed like physical blows, confirming every fear she had about herself and her ability to maintain relationships with decent people. But sitting in Dante's kitchen learning family recipes from Rosa, being welcomed into business dinners as a valued partner, being desired and cherished and protected by someone who saw strength where Derek saw weakness, had fundamentally changed how she understood herself. "You're wrong," Mila said quietly, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. "I know what I am, Derek. I'm someone who survived 2 years of your systematic cruelty and found the courage to leave. I'm someone strong enough to build a new life despite everything you did to break me. And I'm someone who deserves better than anything you ever offered me." Derek's face flushed with rage at her response, his careful control finally cracking under the pressure of having his narrative challenged so directly. "You think you're better than me now?" he snarled, moving closer in a way that made Lucia whimper with fear. "You think your Mafia boyfriend makes you special, makes you worth something. But I know the truth about you, Mila. I know how pathetic and needy and worthless you really are." The physical attack came without warning, Derek lunging toward her with the kind of uncontrolled fury that suggested he had moved beyond rational planning into purely emotional response. But before his hands could reach her, before he could make contact that would have triggered every trauma response Derek had instilled in her over 2 years, Dante appeared from the shadows like something out of a nightmare. The confrontation between the two men was brief and decisive, Derek's desperate aggression no match for Dante's controlled precision and professional training. Within moments, Derek was on the ground with Dante standing over him, the threat neutralized with an efficiency that spoke to experience in handling dangerous situations. "It's over," Dante said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of finality that made it clear Derek's ability to terrorize anyone had ended permanently. As Marco and 2 other men appeared to secure Derek and free Lucia. As the warehouse filled with people whose primary concern was ensuring everyone's safety and cleaning up the aftermath of Derek's desperation, Mila found herself looking at Dante with new understanding. This was who he was beneath the expensive suits and careful gentleness. Someone capable of decisive violence when violence was necessary to protect innocent people. Someone willing to risk his own safety and resources to eliminate threats to people he cared about. Someone whose power came not from the need to control others, but from the commitment to shield those who couldn't shield themselves. When the immediate crisis had been resolved, when Lucia had been checked by a doctor and was safely on her way back to college with protection that would ensure Derek's organization couldn't threaten her again, Mila and Dante found themselves alone in his penthouse dealing with the emotional aftermath of everything that had happened. "I love you," Mila said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess herself or worry about timing or appropriateness. "Not because you saved me, or because you protected my sister, or because you gave me somewhere safe to live. I love you because of who you are, because of the way you see the world and the way you treat people and the way you make me feel like I'm worth protecting." Dante's response was immediate and comprehensive, his arms coming around her with the kind of desperate relief that suggested he had been waiting to hear those words for longer than she had realized. "I love you too," he said against her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "I love your strength and your courage and the way you've rebuilt yourself from nothing into someone extraordinary. I love the way you fit into my world like you were always meant to be here. And I love the way you make me want to be worthy of the trust you've given me." The conversation that followed, conducted in the safety of his living room while the city sparkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, was about more than just mutual declarations of love. It was about choosing a future together despite the dangers and complications that came with Dante's world, about building something lasting from the foundation of trust and protection and genuine partnership they had created. When Mila told him she wanted to stay, wanted to build a life with him regardless of the risks and challenges that would entail, Dante's smile was brighter than anything she had ever seen. The woman who had frozen in terror when Derek walked into Romano's restaurant was gone, replaced by someone who could face down threats and make deliberate choices about her own future. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, that future looked bright with possibility. 1 week after Derek's elimination, the Portland Police Department officially closed their investigation into his disappearance with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that suggested certain influences had been brought to bear on the proceedings. Detective Morrison, the officer who had taken Mila's initial statement months ago when she first tried to report Derek's harassment, called personally to inform her that the case was being classified as a voluntary missing person situation. Derek Matthews appears to have left town voluntarily, Detective Morrison explained, his tone suggesting he understood more about the situation than his official report would ever reflect. His vehicle was found at the airport long-term parking, and there's evidence he purchased a one-way ticket to Mexico. Given his financial difficulties and pending legal troubles, this seems consistent with someone choosing to disappear rather than face consequences. Mila listened to the explanation with the kind of detached interest that came from knowing exactly what had really happened while appreciating the convenient fiction being constructed for public consumption. Derek wouldn't be threatening anyone ever again, and the official story provided closure without requiring uncomfortable questions about methods or accountability. After hanging up, she found Dante in his office reviewing contracts for a new restaurant location, his reading glasses giving him an almost scholarly appearance that contrasted beautifully with his reputation for being one of the most dangerous men in the Pacific Northwest. The domestic normalcy of the scene, the way he looked up from his paperwork to smile at her with genuine warmth, still amazed her after weeks of living together. "It's official," Mila said, settling into the comfortable chair across from his desk that had become her favorite spot for their morning conversations. Derek Matthews has voluntarily relocated to Mexico to start a new life far away from his past mistakes. Dante's smile was satisfied in a way that suggested he had been personally involved in crafting the narrative that would allow everyone to move forward without complications. "Vincent Torino sends his regards, by the way," Dante said, removing his glasses and giving her his full attention. Apparently, Derek's debt has been forgiven due to circumstances beyond his control. Vincent was quite understanding about the whole situation. The casual way Dante mentioned resolving Derek's financial obligations, ensuring that even his criminal associates had no reason to continue pursuing someone who no longer existed, demonstrated the thoroughness with which he approached problems that threatened people he cared about. That evening, as they prepared dinner together in the kitchen that had become the heart of their domestic life, Dante brought up the conversation Mila had been both hoping for and dreading since the night they first made love. "I've been thinking about our future," he said, his tone careful in the way that meant he had been planning this discussion for some time. "About what you want, what I want, what we want together." Mila set down the wooden spoon she had been using to stir the risotto and turned to face him fully, recognizing the significance of the moment even before he continued speaking. "I don't want you to feel pressured by circumstances or gratitude or any sense of obligation," Dante continued, his green-gray eyes serious and intent. "I want you to choose this life, choose me, choose us, because it's what you genuinely want for yourself." The careful way he approached the topic, his explicit concern for her agency and autonomy, made her love him even more than she already did. After 2 years with Derek, who had never given her real choices about anything, having Dante prioritize her freedom to choose felt like the most romantic gesture imaginable. "I've already chosen," Mila said quietly, moving closer until she could rest her hands on his chest and feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. "I chose when I decided to trust you with my life. I chose when I let you into my bed and my heart. I'm choosing again right now when I tell you that I want to stay here, with you, permanently." Dante's expression transformed with relief and joy, but he wasn't finished with the conversation. "There's something else," he said, reaching into his pocket to withdraw a small velvet box that made Mila's breath catch in her throat. "Something I've been wanting to ask you properly." The ring inside was perfect in a way that suggested he had been paying attention to her preferences since long before she realized he was interested in her romantically. Not the massive diamond that Derek had chosen to show off his wealth, but a vintage emerald surrounded by small diamonds that caught the kitchen light like captured stars. "Mila Santos," Dante said, dropping to one knee right there between the stove and the kitchen island. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my partner, my family? Will you let me spend the rest of my life protecting you and loving you and building something beautiful together?" The proposal was everything Derek's had never been, personal and thoughtful and focused entirely on their future together rather than on the impression it would make on other people. When Mila said yes through tears of joy, when she let him slide the ring onto her finger and kiss her with the kind of passion that suggested he had been holding his breath waiting for her answer, she felt like she was finally becoming the person she had always been meant to be. Meeting Dante's extended family was an experience that required all of her newfound confidence and none of the terror she had expected. His mother, Isabella Romano, was a formidable woman in her early 70s with silver hair and sharp dark eyes that missed nothing, but her assessment of Mila was thorough rather than hostile. "You make my son smile," Isabella observed during their first dinner together at the family's restaurant in Little Italy, her accented English carrying the weight of decades spent evaluating potential additions to the Romano clan. "He has been too serious for too long, too focused on business and responsibility. A man needs a woman who reminds him how to be happy." Dante's uncle Salvatore and his cousins treated Mila with the kind of warm acceptance that suggested Dante had already established her importance to the family through private conversations. They asked about her background and interests with genuine curiosity rather than interrogation, and when she mentioned her sister Lucia's college studies, they immediately began discussing scholarship opportunities and internship programs that could benefit a young woman interested in art therapy. The family dynamics were complex in ways that Mila was still learning to navigate, but the fundamental respect for her relationship with Dante was never in question. She was introduced to neighbors and family friends as his fiancée with pride rather than reluctance, included in conversations about business and family matters with an assumption of permanent belonging that felt both overwhelming and wonderful. Planning their wedding became a collaborative effort that involved 3 generations of Romano women, each with strong opinions about traditions that needed to be observed and modern touches that would make the ceremony meaningful for the couple themselves. Isabella insisted on a ceremony at the family estate in Sicily, where Dante's grandparents had been married and where every Romano for 4 generations had exchanged vows. The trip to Sicily 2 months after their engagement was Mila's first experience traveling outside the United States, and seeing Dante in the landscape of his heritage gave her new understanding of the man she had agreed to marry. The family estate was sprawling and beautiful, all stone walls and olive groves and views of the Mediterranean that looked like postcards come to life. Standing in the small chapel where Dante's ancestors had been married for generations, wearing a dress that had been altered from his grandmother's wedding gown with modern touches that made it uniquely hers, Mila felt connected to something larger than just their individual love story. The ceremony was conducted partly in Italian and partly in English, with traditions that went back centuries combined with vows they had written themselves. When Dante promised to protect and cherish her for all the days of his life, when she promised to stand beside him through whatever challenges their world might present, when they exchanged rings that represented not just their commitment to each other, but their integration into a family and tradition that would outlast them both, Mila felt like she was finally home in a way she had never experienced before. The wedding night was magical in ways that had nothing to do with the luxury suite overlooking the Mediterranean and everything to do with the complete trust and love they had built together. Making love as husband and wife, knowing that they had committed to building a life together regardless of what obstacles they might face, felt like the culmination of a journey that had started with terror and ended with joy. 6 months later, Mila stood behind the bar at Romano's newest location, watching her husband interact with his young nephew Paolo while discussing plans for expanding their restaurant empire. The sight of Dante's natural ease with children, the patient way he answered the 6-year-old's questions about business and responsibility, made her unconsciously rest her hand on the gentle swell of her belly where their own child was growing. The pregnancy had been a surprise, but not an unwelcome one, another sign that their life together was expanding in all the directions that mattered most. Dante had been overwhelmed with protective instincts when she told him the news, immediately consulting with doctors and nutritionists and security specialists to ensure that both she and the baby would have every possible advantage. Working alongside him to build their business empire had given Mila purpose and direction that went beyond just being protected by a powerful man. She had discovered a talent for hospitality and customer relations that made her invaluable to their restaurant operations, and Dante treated her insights and opinions with the kind of respect that made her feel like a true partner rather than just a wife. "You know, watching you with your family and thinking about building our own, I realized something important," Mila said, moving closer to where Dante was teaching Paolo how to properly fold napkins for the dinner service. "Sometimes protection comes from the most unexpected places, from people you never thought would understand your situation. Have you ever experienced something like that, where someone appeared in your life just when you needed them most? Maybe someone you initially misjudged or didn't think could help you. The question was directed toward the future, toward people who might be watching their story unfold and wondering about their own possibilities for finding safety and love in unexpected places. Dante looked up from his napkin demonstration to smile at his wife, his expression warm with the kind of contentment that came from building something meaningful with someone you loved completely. "I think the most important thing I've learned," he said, reaching out to touch her hand in a gesture that was both casual and intimate, "is that real protection isn't about controlling someone or isolating them from the world. It's about giving them the security and confidence they need to become the strongest, happiest version of themselves." As the afternoon light streamed through the windows of their restaurant, as the sounds of family conversation and clinking dishes created the soundtrack of their new life together, Mila reflected on the journey that had brought her from frozen terror to confident partnership. The woman who had dropped a tray of food rather than face her abusive ex was gone, replaced by someone who could stand beside one of the most powerful men in the city as an equal partner in building their future. When closing time arrived and they walked home together through the streets of Little Italy, Dante's hand protective on her back, and their conversation focused on plans for the nursery and names for the baby, Mila realized that she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. She had found a love that made her stronger rather than smaller, a man who protected her by building her up rather than tearing down potential threats, a family that welcomed her contributions rather than merely tolerating her presence. Most importantly, she had found herself again, the person Derek had tried to destroy but who had been there all along, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Standing in the elevator that carried them up to the penthouse that was now truly their home, watching Dante's reflection in the polished doors as he absently planned security arrangements for their growing family, Mila smiled with the kind of deep satisfaction that came from knowing you were exactly where you belonged. The future stretched ahead of them bright with possibility, filled with children and restaurants and family gatherings, and all the ordinary, extraordinary moments that made up a life built on genuine love and mutual respect. And for the first time in her adult life, Mila faced that future without fear, confident in her ability to handle whatever challenges might come and secure in the knowledge that she would never again have to face them alone.